So after having a month's break, we're back again to continuing our reading through Tracts and Traces by Paul Fiddes. This is our 7th meeting, and it's really good to welcome Dr. Steve Harmon, who teaches at Gardner-Webb University. He teaches in systematic and historical theology, but a lot of Baptist and ecumenical in that teaching, and is perhaps Mr. Ecumenical Theologian amongst Baptists today. That's where his major focus of his work has been in several books, and has recently, well, in the last couple of years, written an article on Paul Fiddes' ecumenical theology. And so I think we're in safe hands and good hands as we engage with this chapter where Paul talks about ecumenism and a Baptist approach to ecumenism. So Steve, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce us to this chapter and then perhaps to pose us some questions for our conversation. Thank you for joining us and being part of this.
You're welcome, and thank you for the invitation. Andy mentioned the article that I'd published in the journal Perspectives in Religious Studies on Paul Fiddes as ecumenical theologian. What I thought I would do is draw from some of the main points that I make in that to contextualize the larger framework of Paul Fiddes' ecumenical theology, which receives expression not only in this chapter, but really throughout Tracts and Traces. I hope to point out some ways in which, while there is focused attention on ecumenical matters in chapter 9, it really is, as I know you've been noticing, a theme that runs throughout this book. Now, I think that Paul is both the most prominent constructive theologian identified with the Baptist tradition and our most significant ecumenical theologian. I have to award the title Mr. Ecumenical Baptist Theologian to Paul rather than myself. And I think that Paul's constructive theology and his ecumenical theology are inextricably linked. His participatory account of Trinitarian koinonia is not only central to his systematic theological program, it's also at the core of his distinctive contributions to the faith and order stream of the modern ecumenical movement as a Baptist ecumenist. Paul's work in ecumenical theology really is the ecclesiological outworking of this core concept of Trinitarian participation that lends coherence to his systematic explorations of other doctrinal loci. Let me quickly offer a brief sketch of Paul's work as an ecumenist. It has roots in his theological education. It formed him well for this work at Regent's Park College in the ecumenical context of Oxford University. Like others trained there, including some of you, Paul was prepared to be a local church minister whose role as a congregational theologian in residence would have an ecumenical orientation. His subsequent doctrinal study wasn't in systematic theology, but it was in Old Testament, a field in which I should note that Baptist scholars in the UK had long been making ecumenically recognized contributions in a way that eclipsed the profiles that Baptist scholars in other theological disciplines have had beyond the circles of Baptist theological education. And then, in his transition to becoming a constructive theologian, he did postdoctoral studies in systematic theology with Jürgen Moltmann at Tübingen. That was in the midst, in 1976 and 1977, of the time when Moltmann was serving as an influential member of the WCC Commission on Faith and Order. This, I think, had an impact on Paul's developing ecumenical consciousness. Across his career as an academic theologian, Paul has been active as a Baptist ecumenist. He's served as co-chair of the International Bilateral Conversations between the Baptist World Alliance and the Anglican Communion, that was 2000 through 2005. He was co-editor of the published report from that dialogue. He was also co-chair of Phase 2 of the International Dialogue between the BWA and the Catholic Church, 2006 through 2010, and he was co-editor of that agreed report as well. He was also a member of joint commissions for 2 series of a national bilateral between the Baptist Union of Great Britain and the Church of England. He was the sole reporter or editor of the report from the second series of those conversations. Paul also represented the BWA in pre-conversations with the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarchate in the 1990s and 2000s. He was chair of the BWA Commission on Doctrine and Christian Unity, served as a member of the General Synod of the Church of England as an ecumenical representative. Paul's also participated in multilateral ecumenical dialogue, in particular the joint working group at the World Council of Churches and the Catholic Church, and was also part of the WCC Faith and Order consultation on baptism. I should also note that while there is a proper distinction between ecumenism as intra-Christian dialogue and interreligious dialogue, Paul was also editor of the Baptist response to the document A Common Word Between Us and You that was issued issued by Islamic scholars and leaders back in 2007. A consistent theme in Paul's constructive work has been his participatory account of Trinitarian koinonia, which is an understanding of God as essentially relational and communal, one that retrieves the patristic concepts of perichoresis and theosis. It makes social Trinitarian connections between the triune God and humanity in the image of this God. And all of this for Paul is also informed by critically appropriating some aspects of process thought. Now, all of this enables Paul to portray the divine-human relationship as one in which God participates in human life and humanity is drawn into participation in the divine life, leading toward the fullness of community as God's goal for the world, which includes ecumenical church community in some ways that we'll be exploring. While what I've just characterized as Paul's participatory Trinitarian theology of koinonia, while that's given expression especially in Participating in God, which was published in 2000, that wasn't a novel thought in his thinking. It's probably where he develops his Trinitarian theology and its relevance for Christian living most fully. But it was already the overarching theological framework of Paul's first monograph-length ventures into constructive theology. His 2 books published within a year of each other, The Creative Suffering of God in 1988, and Past Event and Present Salvation the following year. In the first book, it was that sort of participatory Trinitarianism that made it possible to propose what is arguably a thicker imagination of the divine experience of human suffering than the one offered by Moltmann in The Crucified God, although he's heavily indebted to Moltmann's insights. In the second volume, Past Event and Present Salvation, this leads Paul to base his study of the atonement on the conviction that in Christ, God participated to the utmost in the human predicament and has never journeyed farther into the depths of God's creation. 2 years after the publication of Participating in God, participatory Trinitarianism reappears in the focus of this discussion group, Tracks and Traces, This time, it's the theological rationale for reframing Baptist ecclesiology in ecumenical perspective. It should be noted that most of this work had its first incarnation as previously presented or published papers or articles that overlapped during the period in which Paul was writing Participating in God. So there's a sense in which participating in God is an ecclesially generic exploration of the implications of this participatory Trinitarianism for Christian living, although he does here and there reference some Baptist convictions and practices in that book. Tracts and Traces is the ecclesially specific outworking of Paul's account of participatory Trinitarianism in the form of Baptist ecclesiological proposals. At the outset of this book's first chapter, he explains that tracts in the title refers to pathways taken in the Baptist tradition in relation to the whole Christian tradition and the pathways it encompasses that have the potential still to offer guidance for the present day. And traces are the partial apprehensions of the ineffable God that can point to God and enable us to participate in God's life and appear only in the context of community, which is going to be a significant ecumenical theme. In the tracts of the Baptist tradition, Paul discovers the traces of a theology of participatory Trinitarianism. The Baptist emphasis on covenant as the basis for congregational life has had in mind not simply a human act of commitment to each other, but an intersection between the promise-making of members of a local congregation and God's eternal covenant of grace, in which there's an integration of the horizontal and vertical dimensions of the covenant. And he suggests that the centrality to Baptist communities of covenant conceived in this way should mean that Baptist theologians will be interested in the theological idea of participation in God. The remainder of Tracts and Traces reframes Baptist covenantal ecclesiology in light of this participatory account of Trinitarian koinonia in a way that has profound ecumenical implications. The connections between participatory Trinitarianism and Baptist ecclesiology are made most fully in chapter 4, where the concern is not simply the activity of God through the church, but the sharing of the church in God. It's an ecclesiology of participation, which tells us as much about the nature of God who lives in communion as about the church as a social unit. In this chapter, the focus is primarily on the fellowship of the congregation, but it ends with an opening to forms of participation that transcend the local fellowship. This is one of those places where I think a key expression of Paul's Baptist ecumenical theology is not only in chapter 9, but it's really integral to the whole book. This is a quotation from it. He says, "There needs to be a balance between dependence and independence in any human relationship, and the maturity to achieve this usually comes from being part of a wider context of relations beyond the immediate people involved. Healthy particular relationships are always a part of a wider sphere, a network of relationships whose edges we can never calculate. This engagement of the community in the triune God places its members in the context of relations as wide as the world, as God opens up the divine life to include all creation. That globally wide context of relations certainly includes ecumenical relationships. There are other chapters that tease out of the tracts of the Baptist tradition, traces of possibilities for inhabiting the network of relationships with the whole church more fully, especially in connection with Baptist perspectives on the nature and function of ecclesial authority, baptism, the Eucharist, and the focus of our chapter, the ecumenical movement itself. Participating in God had framed authority in perichoretic terms rather than exercising authority in dominating ways. The God whose inner life is marked by mutuality and reciprocity both models a non-hierarchical exercise of authority and invites humanity not merely to imitate it, but to participate in it in both church and the civil order. In Tracts and Traces, Paul offers a non-hierarchical account of how authority functions in Baptist congregational polity. No surprise there. But here he focuses on the connection of the church with the divine exercise of authority in the rule of Christ, who, as head of his body, draws the church into the life of these perichoretic relationships. Now, such a critique of hierarchical models of authority that predominate elsewhere in the church could work against ecumenical convergence on the matter of church order, but Paul frames it so as to create openings for Baptist recognition of and participation in expressions of church beyond Baptist congregational and associational life, and to welcome the voices of the whole church into the efforts of Baptist congregations to bring their life together more fully under the rule of Christ. Paul locates the rule of Christ in the church, both in the gathered local congregation and the embodiment of the church in various forms of translocal fellowship. Here's another key place, I think, where Paul's Baptist perspectives on ecumenism are not only in chapter 9. Another quotation from chapter 1, the liberty of local churches to make decisions about their own life and ministry is not based in a human view of autonomy or independence or in selfish individualism, but in a sense of being under the direct rule of Christ who relativizes all other rules. This liberating rule of Christ is what makes for the distinctive feel of Baptist congregational life, which allows for spiritual oversight or episcope, both by the whole congregation gathered together in church meeting and by the minister called to lead the congregation. Since the same rule of Christ can be experienced in assemblies of churches together, there is also the basis here for Baptist associational life and indeed for participating in ecumenical clusters. This suggests that a Baptist gathered church ecclesiology is, at least in theory, able to grant a substantial degree of ecclesiality, not only to various forms of denominational translocal associations of Baptists, but even to ecumenical gatherings such as National Council of Churches, the WCC, joint commissions of national, regional, and international bilateral dialogues, because all of these embodiments of the church are instances where 2 or 3 are gathered in Jesus' name for the purposes of bringing their life under the lordship of Christ, even when the members of these embodiments of the church do not belong to the same local fellowship or denominational communion. In chapter 5, Paul fleshes out what it means for the whole church to seek together the mind of Christ in the church meeting. As you've discussed that before, and I'm not going to read that quotation, you can find it on page 86 of Tracts and Traces. At the conclusion of that, Paul says, in all this, the pastor's voice is the one that carries weight, provided that pastors have created trust in their leadership through service. In this kind of paradigm, pastors share in the congregational exercise of episcope, but the weight their voice carries is associated with the catechetical task of equipping the members of the congregation with the resources they need for seeking the mind of Christ. Paul doesn't name there all the resources God has given for the church for finding this common mind, but I suggest that here There's an implicit opening for pastors in the teaching dimension of their exercise of oversight to have the ecumenical function of bringing the doctrine, worship, and practice of other congregations, other Christian traditions, the whole Christian tradition, to bear on the congregation's process of discerning how Christ is leading them to bring their life together more fully under his rule. Participatory Trinitarianism enables Paul to make two moves in his treatment of baptism that represent openings for Baptist convergence with other Christian traditions, with different theologies and practices of baptism, and vice versa. The first has to do with its sacramental character. It's true that prior to Baptist reactions against the Oxford movement in the 19th century, Baptist confessions of faith routinely called baptism a sacrament. And it's true that in the 20th century, many Baptists have begun to recover a more sacramental understanding of baptism. But much of the Baptist tradition has been marked by an anti-sacramentalism, sometimes bordering on Gnosticism, in its reluctance to recognize that God may make use of material means in acting transformatively in human life. But in chapter 6 of Tracts and Traces, it's the participation of the triune God, not only in human life, but in creation itself, that makes baptism an event in which God works through material means to draw people into participation in God and God's network of relationships. He's interpreting the materiality of the Baptist practice of baptism as implying a robustly sacramental theology in which there is the richest expression of the link between redemption and creation. This is gesturing toward possibilities for ecumenical convergence with other traditions' more sacramental baptismal theologies. Participatory Trinitarianism also helps Paul in chapter 7 to characterize baptism as integral to a process or journey of Christian initiation, the whole of which is immersion into the threefold fellowship of God who is Trinity. Well, that treatment is one that leads Paul to urge Baptists and their dialogue partners to abandon the stereotypes that infant baptism only expresses divine grace and that believers' baptism only witnesses to human faith. He's drawn this paradigm for baptismal convergence into recent Baptist ecumenical dialogues with other churches that, while joining Baptists in baptizing believers who have decided to follow Jesus in baptism, they also baptize infants born to believing parents and nurtured in the faith of the church toward a faith claimed personally. And we'll come back to that as an ecumenical proposal Paul makes. Chapter 8, the last chapter you discussed, then approaches Eucharistic theology and practice in a manner open to ecumenical convergence with movements that parallel those Paul made in his treatment of baptism. The supper, too, through material means, draws us into deeper participation in the triune God's participation in our lives and our world in ways that cannot be bound to particular explanatory theories of how Christ becomes present in the meal. And there is more than one way in which the place of baptism within the journey of initiation into the fellowship of the triune God can lead to the table. And then, of course, there is chapter 9, which our discussion today engages. But before I turn to that, let me say a quick word about Paul's outsized influence on bilateral ecumenical dialogues with Baptist participation, in particular those with the Anglican Communion and the Catholic Church. In both the Baptist-Anglican dialogue and phase 2 of the Baptist-Catholic dialogue, Paul served as co-chair and co-editor of the jointly produced agreed reports. Both published reports are the lengthiest of the reports produced by any of the international bilateral dialogues involving all Christian communions that have burgeoned in the half century since Vatican II. And these two reports, for which Paul was responsible, are arguably the most substantial of these reports. If one has read Fiddes, one can easily hear his voice throughout these reports. They are the work of all the members of the delegations to these conversations, but the reports bear the unmistakable imprint of Paul's own ecumenical theology. In the Anglican dialogue, Paul's perspectives on the major themes addressed in the conversations, ecclesial continuity, confession of the apostolic faith, mission and ministry, baptism, church membership, the Eucharist, episcopae, the meaning of ecclesial recognition, these have overlapped with and perhaps influence the way that the proposed convergences are presented in the report. I call attention to two specific examples of these. First, substantiating that report's claim that there is more common ground between Baptists and Anglicans in appeal to the historic creeds than is often supposed. There is certainly no disagreement about the contents of the creeds. The report includes a passage that qualifies the standard description of Baptists as non-creedal, with Baptist examples of affirmations of the content of the ecumenical creeds. If one compares that passage in the dialogue report with the top paragraph on page 9 of Tracts and Traces, it doesn't require sophisticated source-critical analysis to recognize the source material behind the passage in the agreed Baptist-Anglican dialogue report. It comes almost directly from that passage of Tracts and Traces. An only slightly adapted version of this passage also appears in the report from the second series of conversations between the Baptist Union of Great Britain and the Church of England that Paul edited in 2015. A second example of Paul's influence on the Baptist-Anglican International Dialogue Report is its section on baptism and the process of initiation. It seeks to move beyond the impasses inevitably confronted by Credo-Baptist and Pedo-Baptist communions when common baptism is the ecumenical paradigm proposed for convergence. Instead, the report proposes the recognition that the beginning of the Christian life or initiation is not so much a single event, but a process or journey which may extend over a considerable time. This is the paradigm that Paul had commended in Tracts and Traces. The delegations to the Anglican Baptist Joint Commission embraced it, and through the publication of the report, submitted it to the churches of their communions for consideration in the process of reception. But they've done so, at least in part, through the persuasiveness of Paul's theological voice in the commission. With reference to the report from Phase 2 of the Baptist Catholic Dialogue, for the sake of time, I'll simply note that aspects of that dialogue's convergences in understandings of the nature of ecclesial communion, baptism, and the role of Mary in the life of the church are precedented by or have parallels in Paul's published theological work. Again, this reflects the persuasive influence that Paul has had on both Baptist and Catholic fellow members of the Joint Dialogue Commissions. The chapter we're discussing today introduces Baptists to the recent emphasis of the ecumenical movement on a Trinitarian koinonia ecclesiology in ways that address Baptist concerns about what unity might mean. Not one world church, but churches in full communion with one another in a unity marked by diversity, rooted in the triune God's unity and diversity. At the same time, the chapter presses Baptists to embody in a movement toward visible unity the implications of the invisible spiritual unity that they already affirm. Now, this chapter is an expansion of a lecture originally delivered at Whitley College in Australia in 2001. Both that lecture and its publication 2 years later in the form of this chapter in Tracts and Traces, they precede Paul's subsequent engagement with a newer approach to ecumenical engagement that has been gaining traction in the international ecumenical community in recent years. As Paul notes in chapter 9, some older approaches to ecumenism perhaps created Baptist resistance to institutional expressions of the quest for Christian unity, like the WCC, by giving the impression that the price of visible unity might be the surrender of some of the things held most dear by each church. Since Paul published this chapter, there's been a more explicit recognition of another paradigm that Paul will later have some involvement in engaging in some of his own writings. Receptive ecumenism, it's not named in Tracts and Traces. This is a feature of Paul's later ecumenical work since then. Receptive ecumenism is an approach to ecumenical dialogue according to which the communions in conversation with one another seek to identify the distinctive gifts that each tradition has to offer the other and which each could receive from the other with integrity. 3 years after Tracts and Traces was published, in 2006 at Durham University, there was an international conference on receptive ecumenism that defined that enterprise in this way. The primary emphasis is on learning rather than teaching. Each tradition takes responsibility for its own potential learning from others and is in turn willing to facilitate the learning of others as requested, but without dictating terms and without making others' learning a precondition for attending to one's own. Paul Fiddes has become a notable Baptist participant in this receptive ecumenism project. In an article published in 2008 in the journal Louvain Studies, he embraces this paradigm and responds to the challenge of considering what Baptists might learn and receive from others among the Christian traditions. When in that article, Paul affirms a suggestion that the result of this exercise should not only be to anticipate the time when all will be one in Christ, but also to become more deeply, more richly, more fully what we already are, whether Catholic, Anglican, or Baptist, or Methodist, through a process of imaginatively and lovingly exploring others' particular gifts. This coheres with his development in Tracts and Traces in chapter 9 of a communion ecclesiology in which, when unity is made more fully visible, there remains diversity in unity, rooted in the unity in diversity of the triune God. So that this movement toward Trinitarian koinonia reflected in the koinonia of the one church more visibly, it is possible that there will remain the diversity represented by, as Paul names them, Catholics and Anglicans and Methodists and Baptists, who in this diversity are able to share these gifts that are distinctive to each tradition with each other, learn from those gifts, incorporate those gifts into the life of their own diverse traditions without giving up the good gifts that makes them those diverse traditions, that kind of unity and diversity mirrors the life of the triune God, who is unity in diversity. Now, in that 2008 article, Paul identified 4 specific areas in which Baptists might more intentionally learn something from the wider church through the practice of receptive ecumenism, namely tradition and how it's embodied, episcopacy, infant baptism, and the visibility of the church. Again, for the sake of time, I'll simply refer you to the 2008 article to see how he develops these in relation to what Baptists could learn from how other Christians approach tradition, episcopacy, even infant baptism, and how the church is visible. The whole receptive ecumenism project could easily be rooted in the participatory Trinitarian koinonia ecclesiology of Paul Fiddes, I think. Such an exchange of gifts is a way of participating more fully in the ecclesial life of one another, even while participating more fully in the life of the triune God, who is the giver of these gifts to the churches. Paul doesn't explicitly make that move himself, but his embrace of the ecumenical paradigm of receptive ecumenism can be seen as yet another expression of the participatory Trinitarianism that is at the core of both his constructive theological projects and his work as a Baptist ecumenical theologian, including what we've read in chapter 9. Now, with this as background for talking about the way that Paul engages ecumenism in Baptist perspective in Tracts and Traces in chapter 9, one question that I would raise for your discussion is, of these contemporary developments that he surveys early in the chapter, which one do you feel is more promising? If you had to pick only one of these trends that Paul surveys, which do you think is more promising for Baptist ecumenical engagement, and why? That's one question I think we could engage. Another is, what is your overall reaction to the ecumenical proposals of Paul Fiddes? Is he offering a viable way forward that Baptists, whether individual Baptists or in their particular local church communities, could use to engage other Christians to become more fully the one body of Christ, especially at the grassroots? And maybe a third question, what questions would you like to ask Paul Fiddes, or each other as we were engaging the thought of Paul Fiddes at this point? What needs clarifying in some of the ecumenical writing that you've read here in chapter 9? I hope that'll give us plenty to talk about in this next time together. Andy, give us guidance now for doing that.
Thanks, Steve, for helping us get a sense of that chapter, but also the sense of Paul as an ecumenical theologian in the whole of Tracts and Traces, but wider as well. Perhaps it gives us a sense of where Paul is coming from in chapter 9 in particular. So over to the group. What did you make of this chapter, and perhaps the ecumenism that's running through the whole book? And then Steve has asked us some questions. Which of the 3 trends that he identifies at the beginning of chapter 9 do you find most promising? The ground up, the full communion or unity and diversity. And does this land? Does this make sense to be think on the ground in the context that we work in? And what might we ask Paul if we could? We might have a chance to do that in December. Does anyone want to make an initial contribution? Thanks, Steve. for pausing to think.
I do think that if Paul had been writing that chapter today, after his work engaging receptive ecumenism, he probably would have named 4 trends and identified receptive ecumenism as the 4th trend.
Yeah. Julian, did you want to say something?
Tracts and Traces is published in the early 2000s, so it's still in close proximity to the formation of the interchurch process, Churches Together in England, which was designed to, in part, to enable Roman Catholics to take part. If anyone's read, I think it's Martin Cadou's book on the formation of the United Reformed Church, which looks at the broader ecumenical background, he also contends that one of the reasons for pursuing a looser framework was also to prevent the former British Council of Churches Racial Justice Unit and other activist agencies within the structure of the BCC from pursuing radical agendas, or at least perceived as radical by some of the members of the British Council of Churches. So I think my reading of Paul's reflection in Tracts and Traces is that it in part reflects the optimism that was still around in the early 2000s, but I don't think has been borne out over the last 2 decades. So I think there is a bit of a disconnect between Paul's generosity and optimism circa 2003 and what's happened in the last 20 years.
Mm. Mm.
I'd be interested to know if that resonates with the experience or observation of fellow participants tonight.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very interesting that when Churches Together in England is formed and Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, well, I think it was CTE, Churches Together in England, in '96, they wrote a report called To Be One, which was an attempt to kind of, I guess, to do some theological thinking around unity, which I think reflects the 3 trends that Paul mentions at the beginning of the chapter. But really that process, is in my reading, comes to nothing. And since that point, I guess, in the British context, ecumenism has been very much what can we do in terms of mission together, without any kind of real conversations now about unity in a theological way. They seem to be off the radar, which I think perhaps does resonate, Julian, with what you're just saying there. There was perhaps that wasn't fully realized, at least by the time Paul's writing this, and we're now in a different place. But I think, Steve, it was interesting. I was at a symposium back in June, held in Durham, so by Paul Murray, who is Mr. Receptive Ecumenism, which was organised by the Catholics there to engage in a UK context with what the Roman Catholic Church is doing worldwide around synodality. And it was interesting, at the end of that conference, a number of people who were there wondered whether this potentially could be a new beginning for ecumenism in Britain, in the sense of what took place there. I'm not sure I was that. I think it was a very good time together. It was about 24, 36 hours. But again, I think it's one of those things, and maybe, Steve, I don't know if this resonates with you, that when you're in those kind of meetings of the BWA with the Roman Catholics or with the BWA with the Anglicans, there is this real sense of hopefulness, and we're reaching somewhere. But often that work, and I think this comes back to your second question, is it doesn't always land in our churches. And that is the challenge of there is a sense of people finding more convergence or recognizing more diversity and reaching together. But at least amongst Baptists, we kind of we sit within our localism, and are quite happy there. So what, the thing, Steve, is, when the Church of England and the Baptist Union report pushing at the boundaries of unity, that got a very, very poor reception at the Baptist Union National Council, which Paul may well have told you about. He doesn't like to tell people about that. And I think that is reflective, perhaps, of Julian's, you say, Paul's optimism, but that doesn't always, sadly, land in our localism. Tim Ferguson.
I mean, Andy, I think I agree that the emphasis in terms of working with other denominational groups has been around mission, and therefore it's been pragmatic. It's been, what can we do on the ground in our local communities, and let's ignore the theological discussion. I think that's certainly been my experience as a church pastor. But you asked, Steve, about which of these three trends are the most promising. So this is speaking, I'm not looking at the church in this country as a whole. I'm just saying what feels most promising to me as my gut reaction. It is that third, that unity and diversity. And I think I say that recognizing that within the church, Baptist Church in the UK, of course, we have our own internal battles going on at the moment, clearly. And that unity and diversity seems to me to be the only way of moving ahead, where there is an appreciation that we are incomplete without the other, and that without the participation of other groups and other opinions, we are somehow missing a piece of the overall picture, the overall jigsaw puzzle. So that's the one that resonates with me, I think, most strongly. And I therefore really like the participatory language of Paul Fiddes as it applies to that. So I guess I'm thinking that within our own, and maybe, by the way, of course, the discussions, the arguments within our own Baptist family at the moment may mean there's less capacity for ecumenical outlook, because we're too bothered with our own house, getting our own house in order. But for me, the principle would apply internally within the Baptist Union here, but also in ecumenical relationships.
I wonder if you can have unity and diversity without full communion and without it being something that's ground up. It seems to me that if you want the third one, you've got to have the other two. But anyway, Julian, do you want to come back in, and then Gareth?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the 1990s when I was at Battersea Chapel in southwest London and found myself participating in evangelical networks. I think evangelicalism functions in part as a form of ecumenism, but also formal churches together in England gatherings. And, by and large, it was very rare for a Roman Catholic representative to be present, because it was often expected that Roman Catholic clergy, priests would take that role, but they were often spread too thinly within their own network. So I think different denominations perhaps have different reasons for limited participation, and it's not just Baptist localism which can be an inhibiting factor.
Yeah. There's perhaps a localism within all our traditions. Gareth, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just the observation. These three or four approaches are not mutually exclusive. And one important thing I think Tim just mentioned was the fact that until we recognise that we are actually incomplete without the other, we're not going to go anywhere anyway.
Stephen.
Yes, thank you. I suspect that on the board, there's only Brian that will remember this, but going back into the 70s, there were the proposals for unity, which engaged everybody until the Anglicans kicked them into the long grass. The difficulty with ecumenical things has always been the enthusiastic minority.
Yeah.
And if you remember when you were at school, Venn diagrams, there's at the heart of the Venn diagram was where the URC, the Methodist, the Catholic, the Anglican, the Baptist enthusiasts came together. But there was a whole world outside of that that didn't engage. And I suppose if one speaks from a Baptist point of view rather than others, or I think it would be equally sure of others, many of the other church traditions, as well as ours, didn't allow theology to get in the way of ecclesiology. So their structures were actually more important than the theology that might challenge it. And we've never really got beyond that, in my humble opinion. And I think now it is inconceivable, when Paul wrote the book or put the book together, it is inconceivable that we could have imagined in the, certainly in the UK, the loss of reputation from the mainline churches with some of the issues that have gone on. And I would say at large, and Tim has made reference to one already, but there are obviously issues about abuse and abuse of power and so on and so forth, that people outside the church really have less and less trust. At the same time in which the numbers in the churches have gone down significantly, so that each church now is more concerned about self-preservation and really sees the ecumenical stuff at this level as a luxury it can do without. How you get around that, because at least 2 of our denominations are crash diving into the sea over the next 10 years, how you get around that to rekindle an enthusiasm, when I think has been said, it's quite easy for you to do street pastors, to do the stuff, because food banks, it's easy to do that together without asking questions about what does this mean about God, humankind, society, salvation, etc., etc. And it's the questions of theology that are harder to put on the agenda than something very practical.
So Stephen, to push back there, and then Brian, I'll bring. Do you think that was one of Steve Harmon's questions to us? Could Paul's theology here help us? Do you think it does land, or has the potential to land, or it's just that we're just not in that space at all?
I would say, who it's back to Nicholas Flash. Who is the we?
Yeah.
If you're talking about the average person in the chair or the pew, I think that they see someone who goes to St Hilda's or to Our Ladies of Assumption or to Main Road Methodist Church. They don't see them as vastly different. They get on with them, whatever. They never stop and ask the questions about why can you not take the Mass? How come that person hasn't had this particular rite of passage? It has become, I think as Julian was said, really there are now other connections in many churches which cut across the traditional ecumenical ones. And again, in Baptist terms, I think the sort of the growth of a networked evangelicalism is more marked than it would have been 20, 25 years ago.
Brian, you wanted to come in, and then I wonder, Steve, if you want to reflect back on this very British conversation we've been having, it might be interesting. Brian,
I've got to unmute myself. Just to take up something Steve was saying there, back in that heyday of the paradigm changes really in ecumenical relations. I did find, as an involved ecumenist, that it was just the few people in our congregations right across the denominations that were keen on pursuing these matters. Often theology, the ecclesiology, and all that academic stuff played little part in the actual participation in church relationships. I happened in the 1980s to be the last chair of Churches Together in Leicester, and so I was very much involved in the pursuit of exploring those new instruments that came to turn us into churches together in England or wherever. And I then actually went on to be the chair of an LEP steering group looking after LEPs across Leicestershire. And then I became involved myself as an authorised Methodist minister in a Baptist Methodist church. And I was often inspired by Paul's writings, and I hope that I could have brought in my own practice in ecumenism some of those sites, and particularly as Steve was mentioning, that participation in God. That has been an inspiration to me. And as now a long retired Baptist minister, and having been in a meeting in our church today, that's in Kirby Muxloe Free Church, and we spent almost 4 hours, 3.5 hours in painful discussion about the existence of the church. I only raised one question, thinking, should we be discussing the future of Kirby Muxloe Church without talking to our neighbouring Anglican church? We are two churches in a village, and churches together in this area at the moment is almost non-existent. It was a very, very painful church meeting. And so the minister has asked if we could have a chat later on about sort of models of the church. And I think this conversation, I get a bit emotional, I'm sorry. This conversation has given me, particularly some of the things that Steve had said about, particularly about participation and koinonia. I think that is the model that my local church needs to pursue. We're talking, there was a lot to talk about what we should sing and whether we should take pews out. I've been there. I've been involved in 6 churches, and a lot of it is cosmetic. But I think it's when we begin to get down to these kind of issues, sharing outside, not just preserving a church, but being participating in God for the community. That's the important thing.
Thank you, Brian, for sharing that. Just before I ask Steve if he wants to offer any reflections on our conversation so far, Tim, did you want to say anything, as someone who's not said, any reflections that you've got on the chapter or your experiences of ecumenism, good or bad?
Yeah, my confession is I haven't read the chapter. I didn't think I'd be able to make tonight, and I just joined you at the last minute. Yeah, our current situation in Horsham is that there is a kind of what is perceived by many as a fresh movement of the Spirit in terms of the churches working together for mission, where the ministers are praying together. There's a strong sense of unity, a desire to cooperate and outreach, and that's really good. The churches together structures, I think, creaked quite a bit a few years ago when the financial questions and some churches took a step back. So this is really, really welcome, actually, a sense of cooperation and unity. How deep it goes, if we were to sit down and start to talk about theological matters or affirming churches or non-affirming churches, whether that would splinter, I think quite possibly it would. But it feels good at a superficial level. It's something to celebrate. But once you start to drill down in theology, it becomes very, very difficult to find meaningful expressions of unity because we're aware of all that separates us. So I think the participation in God, each of us finding a place within the unity of God in all our diversity, offers a model for that. But working it out in practice is actually very difficult. So that's my contribution for what it's worth.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, quickly come back in. Yeah.
Only to point out, I think that's really important what you said. It's not just that we gather locally with other churches in mission because it's pragmatic. It's in actual fact, we don't do the theology together in order to protect the mission. That's what you're suggesting. In order that we can work locally, for goodness sake, we won't talk about that stuff because we will only divide. And I think that's quite an interesting point.
Steve, my sense is ecumenism in at least in England and perhaps Wales is quite unique. We're kind of an ecumenical laboratory. I think someone might use that in comparison perhaps to the States. And I'd just be interested in your reflections that, it's been a very, at it's not always been, but on this call tonight, we're all in the UK or all in England, I think, here, apart from your good self. So I wondered if you've got any reflections on what we've been saying.
Well, a lot of what you all have been saying about the current ecumenical situation in the UK parallels some of the American experience. I think for us, the problem is exacerbated by rugged American independence, in which the denominations do not need each other. The churches, the local churches within denominations, really don't even need the denominations. And there's also the perhaps distinctively American phenomenon of the mega church, in which the large local congregation really is an island unto itself that needs no connection with any other expression of church and sees it as having self-sufficient resources. So that makes the problem much worse. We also don't have the parallel to your experience, and I, as a Baptist ecumenist in the United States, am keen on learning more from the British experience of LEPs. I think there's a lot of ecumenical promise in at least the idea of doing church planting as an ecumenical venture, with the LEP having already built into it, when there are multiple denominational traditions involved in planting the church, of engaging in receptive ecumenism, so that the local church from the ground up is consciously drawing on aspects of at least the different sponsoring traditions. In terms of the ecumenical trends that Paul noted in this chapter, I think there's a sense in which unity from the roots up needs to be re-engaged. Maybe at the time that Paul wrote it, there was a bit more ecumenical optimism, especially in the UK context, in the air. But the lack of ecumenical engagement at the grassroots, at least in my context, is the pressing ecumenical problem. In my own involvement in faith and order expressions of ecumenism, in particular bilateral ecumenical dialogue, there's been a consciousness the past decade or so that it's well and good for these kinds of things to happen, these kinds of encounters to happen between official denominational representatives. But it really makes no difference if all that happens is that we produce a report that sits on a shelf or in a dark corner of the internet and no one actually does anything with it. But I think there are some possibilities for making this happen more intentionally, that actually are related to some Baptist distinctive concepts like liberty of conscience, our aversion to any coercion of churches or members thereof. There has always been an asymmetry involved in Baptist ecumenical dialogue with other traditions. Another tradition has more official structures of ecumenical implementation, ecumenical reception. If, say, the Lutheran World Federation and the Catholic Church are able to issue a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, there are official structures in which that kind of ecumenical agreement can have some teeth and can, at least in theory, make a difference in what happens at other levels of church. But we don't have a parallel kind of structure in Baptist life, certainly not at the level of the Baptist World Alliance, for making ecumenical convergences stick. But we have the possibility of appealing to the consciences of Baptists to persuade them that this is important, that it makes a difference that we've been able to reach these kinds of convergences with other traditions. We're appealing to you now as to why this is important and what we might conceive of doing at the grassroots in light of it, which means that institutions of theological education bear a lot of the responsibility for helping this happen. In my own work as a theological educator, I tried to introduce my students to what's gone on ecumenically, not only in a course I teach that I'm teaching this very term on ecumenism. It's titled The Quest for Christian Unity. But also when I teach systematic theology, especially when we get into the ecclesiology unit, I'm trying to help students know about what has happened ecumenically and why this ought to be brought to bear on what we're doing, even in the life of local churches. But if in the context of theological education, we can offer an ecumenical formation so that ministers in local churches think this is important. One very specific thing that those ministers could do when there's been, say, a dialogue between the Baptist World Alliance and the Anglican Communion, if in my context in the United States, there's a neighboring local church that is Episcopal, the Episcopal Church in the United States is our local expression of the Anglican Communion, perhaps that Baptist minister and that Episcopal priest could begin meeting to read the report and talk through its implications together. Maybe they could invite some laypersons in their respective churches to be a part of that discussion. Maybe in light of that discussion, they could ask themselves, how could we manifest these convergences in our local life? What could we more fully do together? Not only mission projects, but also common opportunities to worship. Ways to participate in catechetical formation that would share some of our resources. That's just an example of how all of this high-level ecumenical convergence could be brought down to the grassroots, which is where Paul starts out this chapter, unity from the roots upward rather than the top downward.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more reflections, but as we begin to bring our conversation to a close?
Only to ask, you said what questions would we like to ask Paul Fiddes to clarify his ecumenism. Maybe it's not quite this, but I would love to know at this point how optimistic he is. So many years after writing the book about where we're at, and we do get a chance, don't we, Andy?
So we're planning in December. So December, that Paul will join us. So we can bring all our questions from all the different chapters to him, and one by one he'll give us satisfactory answers, which will leave no more questions. That could be the case. We'll see.
I will try to be a part of that, and hopefully maybe the next couple of months too, if there aren't any intervening events.
Yeah. No, we're meeting. Yeah. So, Steve, I think what's been really helpful is you've shown us that actually Tracts and Traces is an ecumenical book, and that we cannot think about Paul without thinking of him as an ecumenical theologian. It's not that he does ecumenism every now and again. Occasionally, he's doing ecumenism whenever he's doing his theology, and I think that's an important thing to note and to take on board. I think you've given us a really interesting challenge at the end about whether we can get together with one of our, Julian, you get together with some of your colleagues and really pushing to the boundaries of unity, Westcott House. And some of us might want to see if we can get together with our Roman Catholic friends or Church of England or Methodist. There was a BWA Methodist report as well, and to do some of that about where that would land. It'd be an interesting conversation if they took place. And Brian, we will be thinking of you and praying for you as you have your conversations with your local Anglican church, and perhaps in a future session you can update us on whether you've got anywhere.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. I just finished quickly with one story. I did have the privilege as a Baptist minister chairing 3 churches, a URC church, a Methodist church, and an Anglican church, seeking to come together as an LEP, which they did. And we spent a year when I chaired meetings and I think I was able to bring that Baptist ecclesiology into getting them to really get to know one another, not only as people, but what made their churches tick from the top. But it was certainly a very bottom-down thing. They did come together eventually. And there was a day which was set aside for the signing of the covenant. It was long after I chaired those meetings, but I was invited to participate, and we went to all 3 churches. We finished in the Methodist church, in which they invited me to preach. But there was also a Eucharist, and sitting next to me, although he wasn't involved, was one of our local Roman Catholic priests, who I knew quite well. And in the Methodist church, it was a lady minister. We had we went out for communion, to receive communion. And as I got up to walk out, as the stewards indicated the row to walk out, Jim, the Roman Catholic priest, followed me out and received communion from a woman Methodist minister. That's grassroots.
Yeah.
But
Brian,
thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah. Okay. Well, next month we're going to be looking at the chapter on salvation, which in a book on, I don't know, is that an odd chapter? Well, perhaps we'll find it's an odd chapter, whether Paul was just kind of complete the book or what. But we will be looking at that chapter on salvation, where he does some more ecumenism again. And I think, Steve, if you had more time, you would tell us how he does that, at least with the Orthodox and everything going in that chapter. Thank you for joining us. Steve, thank you very much for your contributions this evening. We will meet again the 3rd Sunday of October to look at Paul's chapter on salvation. Thank you.